Hi, everybody, and welcome to World History. So, this is going to be our final section of notes for this unit. So, please make sure you are getting all your notes done because you will have a summative assessment over this materials next class. In terms of what we're going to accomplish today, video number 1 will have the opening activity, lecture number 1, and activity number 1. Video number 2 will have lecture 2 and activity 2, and video 3 will have lecture 3 and the final assessment. Our learning objectives today are to examine actions taken by the Nazis at the end of the war, to explain key events like the Nero Order and the Nuremberg trials, to analyze the Nuremberg trials and their impact, to determine the impact of the Holocaust on Europe, and, as always, to continue analyzing quotes and primary sources from the period to develop a greater understanding of the materials being studied. So let's start with our opening activity. So you're going to respond to the following question posted on Google Classroom. This is meant to serve as a refresher of content from last time. You must write a 5-sentence response to receive full credit. Consider the following. What was the role of the partisans? How crucial of a role do you believe they played in resistance against the Nazis during the later parts of the war? Lecture number 1 today will be on violence. I'm going to let you know now, there is some pretty graphic material in this video. If you are not in a place to handle this material, please make sure you are in a place where you can handle it. If that means you need to stop the video at certain points and take a break, feel free to do so. So, 1944 to 1945, the death throes and killing frenzies that marked the end of the war. Basically, it's important to note that Germany decided if they were going to lose the war, they were going to take the world down with them. This is the last stage of the war, and they would continue to kill until the very end. Nazi programs are going to continue, and Jews in places that had managed to evade the Nazis earlier will be caught. During the spring and summer of 1944, they're going to hunt down Jews in Greece and send them to Auschwitz. 400,000 Hungarian Jews will be murdered, and the remaining Roma populations at Auschwitz will also be gassed. As the Germans retreated, they abandoned the killing centers and sent inmates on brutal death marches. We'll talk about those in a little bit. And euthanasia will continue. The last case of euthanasia under the Nazis was a 4-year-old boy 3 weeks after Germany surrendered. With this, they ensured the defeat of Nazism would be costly. So here's a quote from Livia Prince. One morning, we woke up to utter silence. No harsh commands, no dogs barking, not the hated words of Schnell, or Schnell, meaning quickly. The day that dawned was May 8th, 1945. The guards simply vanished. Take a minute and think, how does this quote illustrate the Nazi retreat? So closing in, and by the end of 1944, Germany was under attack from every direction, and the Allies had a great bit of momentum. The Red Army was advancing rapidly. They launched a major offensive on the 3rd anniversary of Operation Barbarossa. Remember, that was the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union. Air raids are also going to peak in 1944, led by British and American forces, killing as many as 500,000 German civilians. Obviously, this is World War II. We have to talk about D-Day on June 6, 1944, the Allied landing at Normandy. They'll liberate Paris in August of that same year and cross the German border a month later. It's important to note, Germany was no match for this continued onslaught of Allied forces. By the early part of 1945, they pretty much had ran out of fuel and ammunition. Things are not looking well. They also relied on forced labor. By 1944, their labor force was made up of 7.5 million forced laborers. They're going to bear the human cost of outfitting the German military. After D-Day, Hitler is going to name Goebbels the Reich plenipotentiary for total war, basically the head honcho of war. And they're going to paint a nasty picture of what would happen if Germany lost. They instructed the press to continue blaming the Jews, and threatened the German public of what Allied victory would look like, meaning Jewish poison, Bolshevik slaughter, and capitalist exploitation and Anglo American imperialism. Basically saying if they did not continue to support the war, they're going to suffer under the Allies. Now, not everybody was on board with Hitler. There was actually an attempt to kill him on July 20th, 1944. This was composed of a network of opponents of the regime, including military men who resented how Hitler carried out the war. They'd hoped to overthrow Hitler, then join up with the Western Allies to fight the Soviets, because again, everyone's scared of communism. They did not want to deal with communism. Now, one of the main people of this movement is Count Helmuth James von Moltke, who is pictured there. He was a devout Christian against Hitler. He actually organized a group of like-minded individuals who wanted a new democratic Germany. Now, due to his faith, he wrestled with the ethical implications of violence. He did not support the assassination. He urged military leaders to overthrow Hitler. Now, to be fair, by the time this attempt happened, Helmuth had already been arrested and was imprisoned in January 1944. He'll eventually be executed. Now, let's look at the plan. The plan was pretty straightforward. Colonel Klaus Schenk von Stauffenberg was to plant a bomb at the Wolf's Lair, Hitler's East Prussian HQ. And then the bomb would go off, and Hitler would be dead, because he would have been killed in the explosion. The death of Hitler would then begin a coup to overthrow the rest of the Nazi government. Seems pretty straightforward, right? Well, unfortunately, it failed. The bomb didn't go off. Well, actually, excuse me, it did go off, but it didn't kill Hitler. Whoa. But Stauffenberg heard the explosion, thinking, oh, nice, Hitler's dead. He starts to send the word out. That's no. He will be caught and executed later that day. Others accused would be put on trial in so-called honor courts, like the People's Court. Most would be humiliated and killed, and it provided an excuse to crack down on anyone that was against Germany, really going against that idea of defeatism again. So, in September of 1944, Hitler ordered the full deployment of resources. This includes the Volkssturm, or the People's Storm. This mobilized all boys and men ages 16 to 60. Some were better prepared than others, others not so much. There was a massive loss of life as a part of this. And by early 1945, true believers thought the war was lost. The German army was falling apart. People were deserting left, right, and center, even though military commanders continued to shoot those that they caught deserting and arrested their family members. Also, roving SS units were going all over German-controlled territory and punishing anyone accused of defeatism. Again, they were not going to give up. Then Hitler signs the Nero Order. For those of you that are obsessed with ancient Rome, yeah, it's referring to that Nero, the one that stood there and watched Rome burn. Basically, they said leave nothing for the Allies. Destroy all infrastructure and anything that was of value as they retreated. This meant a number of things. This meant the destruction of factories, railroads, whole cities, art, people's homes. Basically, if the Nazis couldn't have it, nobody else could. Now, jumping back over to Warsaw for a moment. Remember last time we talked about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising? Well, there's going to be another revolt, this time involving the whole city. This is a second major revolt after the first one in 1943. By August 1944, the Red Army, the Soviets, were approaching from the east. Excuse me. And the Polish Home Army decided to try and liberate the city themselves. Good on them. This is an independent resistance linked to the Polish military and government in exile, with about 60,000 troops. People are going to rally against the Nazis. Now, this is beginning in Old Town at 1700 hours or 5 p.m., led by General Tadeusz Komorowski. It's important to note some Jewish prisoners, when they were freed, would join up and be allowed to join their ranks and help fight. Also, there was an entire women's combat unit of the Polish Home Army that attacked a Waffen SS supply depots full of food. Like, that's awesome. They kicked butt. Now, unfortunately, the Red Army is kind of, well, they stopped on the other side of the river and they're kind of just like, well, we're just going to watch what happens and see what happens. You do you, boo. We're not getting involved. And then Hitler orders the city leveled. 75% of the city of Warsaw will be destroyed, and about 170,000 people will be killed. Some estimates put it closer to 250,000. The resistance in Warsaw will officially be crushed on October 7th, 2nd, 1944. Well, it seems prudent to check in on Germany's allies. There's going to be some dramatic changes. Finland, especially, signed an armistice with the Soviet Union and had never handed over their Jews to Germany, which is interesting to note because had even been some Finnish Jews fighting in the Wehrmacht against the Soviets. Again, that contradiction of that idea of race and blood. In Italy, fighting there continued as German troops blocked the Allied advance. Mussolini clung to power until April 1945. Him and his mistress and a few other people would be executed, and his body hung upside down outside of a gas station for everybody to go up and spit on. Along with this, the Italian campaign, it's important to note, was the deadliest for the Allies. 70,000 Allied troops will be killed, 50,000 Germans killed, and 150,000 Italian civilians. As they lost ground, they continued to kill Jews, especially at a place named La Risera di San Saba, which was a concentration camp in Italy. Now, thousands of prisoners would be tortured and murdered here. Some would be sent to other camps in the east. Think of it kind of like as like a transit camp like Majdanek or Theresienstadt that we talked about a couple lessons ago. Continuing in, we now need to talk about Greece. They're going to send their Jews to Auschwitz, this being the Romanoite Jews. This is the oldest Jewish community in Europe. So one of the oldest communities of Jews in Europe is now being destroyed. And then in Romania and Hungary, by mid-1944, Germany still wanted Romania's oil. But in August 1944, Romania surrenders to the Soviet Union. Hungary wanted to give up back in March. And in October of 1944, Miklos Horthy was caught trying to negotiate a peace deal with the Soviets. So Hitler had him overthrown and really cracked down on Hungary. So until 1944, most Hungarian Jews managed to stay out of German hands until mass deportation started on May 15th, 1944. And between then and July 9th, 1944, 437,000 Hungarian Jews are sent to the killing centers. It's important to note Romani people also face similar treatment, with quotes being said at them like "Rot, you Jew gypsy." So take a second and let's talk about that quote. How does this reflect the views of the Nazis and others towards the Jews and the Roma? Take a minute, talk about it with your table partners. So in April 1944, Jews from Berehov are confined to the ghettos there, and neighbors are going to once again seize the opportunity to plunder and take their property and their homes. Eventually, the killing's going to be postponed due to a labor shortage. So about 100,000 Hungarian Jews will be taken to labor camps to help the war effort. They're not going to be sent to the killing centers. So we have to ask ourselves an important question. If they're losing the war, why do they keep killing people? You'd think, maybe we should focus on one thing, not two things. Well, it showed their commitment to annihilation. And it was a tactic to stay away. Well, people used it as a tactic to stay away from the front lines, specifically those that were guards, police officers, and officials. Cowards were probably more common than fugitives at this point of the war. As this is going on, people are still continuing to get the word out. They continue to tell people about what the Nazis are doing. Rudolf Verba and Alfred Wetzler were actually two Slovakian Jews that escaped from Auschwitz-Birkenau, which is not a very common thing to escape from. They produced an extensive report on the conditions there, and parts were featured in British and American newspapers. They hoped it would serve as a warning, and Verba especially believed that the Allies and Jewish leaders in Hungary did not act as strongly as they could have. Another person we need to talk about is Raoul Wallenberg. He was a Swedish businessman and diplomat who organized the largest rescue operation in Budapest. He set up safe houses under the control of the Swedish embassy, helped many Jewish people escape. However, he was arrested by the Soviets when Budapest was liberated and then disappeared into the gulags. We don't know what happened to him. One could surmise that he was murdered by the Soviets. By July 1944, with the suspended transporting of Jews, the violence did not stop. The new government in Hungary, the Arrow Cross government, was brutal, and they shot 20,000 Jews over the next 2 months. By February 1945, Budapest will be liberated, with about 100,000 Jews remaining alive within the city. I'm going to highly stress that this next section of notes contains some sensitive materials. Again, if you feel yourself becoming overwhelmed, feel free to step out for a moment and come back to this video when you're ready. Let's talk about sexual violence. There are a number of challenges of discussing sexual violence in the Holocaust. It is heavily steeped in taboos, and it's prone to sensationalism and harsh judgment. It's also important to understand it is closely tied with war and genocide, and it's heavily shrouded in secret. So sources are incomplete. While we do have some examples, we don't have many because most people didn't want to talk about that part of their experience. Perpetrators were more likely to and even eager to count how many people they killed, but not how many they sexually assaulted. And victims had many reasons to keep silent, often publicized by those who wanted to use that emotional power for a cause. And the people who experienced that violence are then made invisible or reduced to nothing but the violation. And it's important to note shocking accounts did serve to demonize enemies as brutes. These narratives also obscure sexual violence that occurs within groups and punish those who point it out as traitors. Now, in terms of sexual violence, it took many forms during the Holocaust, mainly like nakedness, debasement, being forced to witness sexual abuse of others being the primary ones. Germans are going to attack women wherever they went, and targets were people of all kinds, and this includes the perpetrators too. Now, it's also important to note that boys and men were also sexually abused. Joseph Kohut, publishing under the name Heinz Heger, highlighted the many forms of sexual violence against people charged as homosexual men. And Pinchas Guder, who, if we jump to our next slide, provided us with a quote. Every morning when you woke up, there were one or two young, good-looking children, usually, which he must have seen during the day or whatever, and he chose them, and they were hanging from the rafters, and they would say, well, they committed suicide, and they would be taken out and thrown onto the heap. This is Pinchas Guder describing young boys being targeted in the camps. Take a moment to reflect on this and be prepared to discuss as a class. Now, not all sex during the Holocaust was violent. Some relationships did not fit the binary of consensual versus coerced. This is where the idea of sexual barter comes into play. It's used to describe the exchange between prisoners in Theresienstadt who still possessed agency. They often use this to trade like food, clothing, like supplies. And intimacy and pleasure could serve as an assertion of life. There are a number of couples that got together while in the camps. And it allows us to make connections with other cases to help us see sexual violence that has been overlooked or ignored, especially in the 1990s. The mass rape of women in Rwanda and formerly Yugoslavia helped change old assumptions about the Holocaust. It's also important to say that commonalities can be empowering. People like Nate Leibscher, who was sexually abused in the camps as a young Polish Jew, was emboldened by his experience to talk about the experiences of those sent to Indian residential schools in Canada. It's Also important to note, sexual violence occurs in extraordinary situations like pogroms, war, and genocide, but also it happens in normal ones as well. All right, here were the sources that were used in the creation of this lesson. I'm going to talk about activity 1 real quick, and then I will wrap up this video. For activity number 1, you're going to access the worksheet posted on Google Classroom titled Hungarian Jews Primary Image Analysis. You'll be presented with 5 images to review. All of these images connect back to what we discussed in lecture number 1. After viewing each image, you will answer the following questions. What is happening in the image? How does it connect back to what we are discussing in class? And how does this reflect the violence inflicted by the Nazis? All right, I'll let you guys get started on that. I'll see you in a moment on video number 2. Bye, everybody.